For 8 years, CEO Adrian Sterling lived in a glass tower, a ghost in his own life. Each day, his chauffeured car slipped through the city, a silent bubble protecting him from a world he no longer cared for. He never noticed the 10-year-old girl on the corner of 3rd and Main, a small, silent figure who was as much a part of the pavement as the cracks. But his chauffeur, Ben, noticed. He saw her haunted eyes, a reflection of a face he remembered from a happier time. For weeks, he said nothing. Then one rainy Tuesday, stuck in traffic, Ben broke the silence. "Sir, forgive me," he said, his voice quiet. "But that girl on the corner, doesn't she remind you of someone?" For the first time in years, Adrian truly looked. And in the face of a beggar girl, he saw the ghost of his long-lost daughter.
This is TS Simple Serene Stories. Before we get back to this touching story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that humanity and miracles are eternal, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get back to the story.
Chapter 1. The weight of the day. The city woke up in layers of sound. The distant growl of sanitation trucks, the rhythmic hiss of a street vendor's grill, the percussive slam of a security gate rolling open. For 10-year-old Alara, the world was a forest of legs. From her spot on the pavement, she saw life as a blur of motion from the knees down. Scuffed work boots, hurried sneakers, the confident click of expensive heels on concrete. She was as much a part of the corner of 3rd and Main as the faded graffiti on the adjacent wall, a silent, observant fixture in the urban landscape. Her guardian, Marcus, left her there each morning with the same ritual. He'd crouch down, his face a complicated mask of what she had learned was affection soured by disappointment. His breath always smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. "You know the rules, Ellie girl," he'd murmur, his hand squeezing her shoulder a little too tightly. "Be quiet, look sad, and don't talk to anyone. People feel sorry for quiet kids." She would just nod, her gaze fixed on the worn leather of his jacket. Marcus wasn't her father. He was just Marcus. He had been there for as long as she could remember, a figure of shifting moods dictated by the cryptic numbers on the betting slips he was always folding and unfolding. A good day meant a hot meal. A bad day meant the weight of his resentment settled over their small, stuffy apartment like a physical presence. He was once her mother's friend, he'd told her. A college friend, from a time before everything went wrong. He was the one who had saved her. This narrative was the foundation of her world, a story he repeated often, polishing it with his own sense of martyrdom. Alara's world was small, but it was hers. In the pocket of her worn coat, her fingers would trace the cool, smooth surface of a gray stone, a perfect oval she'd found in a park she couldn't quite place in her memory. It felt ancient and calm. Her other treasure was hidden, tucked into the lining of her shoe, a photograph, creased and softened with time, of a woman with a brilliant, laughing smile, holding a baby. Her mother. Marcus said her mother had been sick, that she hadn't been strong enough for the world, but in the photo, she looked like the strongest person alive. Alara was homeschooled, which meant Marcus would spend an hour or two with worn-out textbooks spread on their small kitchen table, his patience wearing thin with every wrong answer. There were no doctor visits, no school records, no official papers that tied Alara to anyone. Their life was off the grid, a precarious existence built on forged documents and the city's vast indifference. She watched the legs go by, her mind a quiet theater of stories. The woman in the red heels was a spy. The man with the paint-splattered boots was an artist who painted pictures of the sky. This secret game was her armor. It kept the hollowness at bay. She was a ghost in the city, but in her own mind, she was a queen, ruling a kingdom of quiet observation, waiting for the day to end. Chapter 2. The Fortress of Grief. 34 floors above the corner of 3rd and Main, Adrian Sterling began his day with the sterile hum of a smart home. The blinds rose on a schedule, revealing a panoramic view of a city he owned a significant piece of, but no longer felt a part of. His penthouse was a fortress of minimalism and order, a space scrubbed clean of memories and emotion. At 45, he was a titan of industry, a man whose decisions moved markets, but his personal life was a flat line. Work was his anesthetic. It had been for 8 years, ever since his world had fractured. The source of his grief was a wound that never closed, the disappearance of his 2-year-old daughter, Lily. It hadn't been a kidnapping in the conventional sense. His wife, Anya, brilliant and vibrant Anya, had been consumed by a late-onset postpartum psychosis. The pressures of his work, her isolation, and the relentless demands of a toddler had triggered a break. In her paranoid delusions, she became convinced that Adrian's business rivals were planning to harm their child. So she had run, taking Lily to the one person she believed could protect them. An old college friend, a struggling artist named Marcus. Anya was found months later, the victim of a hit and run, her identity a mystery until it was too late. But Lily was gone, vanished. Adrian had unleashed the full force of his wealth on the problem. He'd hired armies of private investigators, funded task forces, chased down 1,000 dead ends. The trail went cold in a border town. The investigators concluded that Marcus, armed with a new identity, had crossed into a neighboring country, a place where data was a whisper and a man with a child could disappear into the folds of the informal economy. After years of failure, Adrian's hope had finally calcified into a hard, brittle shell of resignation. His life was now a rigid routine of board meetings and financial reports, each successful quarter a hollow victory that did nothing to fill the echoing silence of his home. Chapter 3. The Chauffeur's Conscience. Ben Carter had been driving Adrian Sterling for 15 years. He'd been there for the whirlwind romance with Anya, the joy of Lily's birth, and the silent, terrifying implosion that followed. A former social worker who had seen the worst of the world, Ben had sought the quiet predictability of being a chauffeur after losing his own grandchild to a sudden illness. He understood grief, and he recognized the shape of the hole in his employer's life. For the past month, Ben had noticed the girl. It started as a flicker, a passing glance at the small, still figure huddled on the corner they passed every morning. Then, one day, the sun caught her face just right, and Ben felt a jolt. It wasn't a perfect resemblance, not after 8 years of growth and hardship had sharpened her features. It was in the details, the specific curve of her eyebrow, the way she held her head, a stubborn set to her jaw that was pure Anya. He knew his boss's habits. Adrian lived in his phone, his gaze locked on the blue light of the screen, deliberately blind to the poverty and pain on the other side of the bulletproof glass. So Ben began a quiet campaign. "That poor kid," he'd murmured one morning, his eyes on the rearview mirror. "Out in all weather." Adrian had grunted in response, not looking up. A week later, Ben tried again. "She has the saddest eyes I've ever seen." This time, Adrian glanced up for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he returned to his emails. But a seed had been planted. The campaign culminated on a rainy Tuesday in October. The traffic was snarled, the car inching forward. Ilara sat under the meager shelter of a shop awning, her face pale, her thin jacket soaked through. She looked impossibly small. Ben saw the deep, familiar pain in the girl's posture, and it resonated with the quiet, desperate grief of the man in his back seat. He could stay silent no longer. He cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the silence. "Forgive me for being forward. But that girl on the corner? Doesn't she remind you of someone?" The question hung in the air, a grenade of a sentence. It bypassed Adrian's defenses, pierced through 8 years of carefully constructed apathy. Annoyance warred with a sudden, inexplicable curiosity. He lifted his head, his gaze following Ben's. He didn't just glance this time. He looked. He saw the rain-streaked face, the dark, watchful eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. And in the face of a 10-year-old beggar girl, Adrian Sterling saw the ghost of his daughter. The world outside the window fell away, and for the first time in a very, very long time, he felt something other than numb. He felt a terrifying, world-shattering surge of hope. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The fragile shell of Adrian's apathy, cultivated over 8 agonizing years, did not just crack, it vaporized. The moment he and Ben were back in the silent, leather-scented interior of the car, the numbness that had been his constant companion was replaced by a frantic, terrifying energy. It was hope, raw and savage, and it hurt more than the grief ever had. "Ben," he said, his voice strained, unfamiliar in his own ears. "I need pictures, clear ones, as soon as possible. But she can't see you. He can't see you." Ben nodded, his expression grimly determined. His past as a social worker had prepared him for navigating delicate situations. "I know a few tricks, sir. I'll handle it." The rest of the day was a blur. Adrian sat in his office, the skyline of his city a meaningless backdrop. He ignored the blinking lights on his phone, the urgent emails flooding his inbox. Instead, he stared at an old digital photo frame on his desk, cycling through pictures of a 2-year-old Lily. Lily in a swing, her face alight with joy. Lily with birthday cake smeared across her cheeks. Lily asleep in Anya's arms. He traced the lines of her face on the screen, trying to stretch them, to age them, to see if they could possibly match the haunted eyes of the girl on the corner. The possibility was an agony. He didn't call the investigators who had failed him before. Their methods were archaic, their apologies hollow. He called a new firm, a name he'd gotten from a security briefing, a boutique agency in London that specialized in the impossible, using cutting-edge technology and a network of discreet international operatives. Within hours, 2 of them were in his office. They were sharp, quiet, and listened without interruption as Adrian laid out the entire history, his voice cracking as he spoke of Anya and the cold trail. Ben arrived with a memory card. The photos were remarkable. Clear, candid shots of Ilara, taken from a distance with a powerful lens. The lead investigator, a woman named Kaylin, uploaded the images to a secure laptop. "The old methods were about knocking on doors, Mr. Sterling," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We knock on digital ones. Our facial recognition AI doesn't just search government databases, it scrapes everything. Public social media, news archives, forum avatars, tagged photos from events in your target region. It looks for facial landmarks, ear topography, the unique constellation of the face. It's looking for a ghost. They watched as the algorithm worked, sifting through petabytes of data. Hours passed. The sun set, painting the city in hues of orange and purple that Adrian didn't see. Then, a chime. "We have a potential match," Kaylin said, her voice carefully neutral. Low confidence, but it's a start. On the screen was a photo from a local news website. The article, dated 2 years prior, was about a summer fair in Midvale, a dreary industrial city 100 miles across the border, a place none of Adrian's previous teams had ever thought to look. The photo was of the local mayor shaking hands with a prize-winning farmer. But in the background, out of focus, stood a man with Marcus's sullen posture, and beside him, a small girl with dark, watchful eyes, holding a half-eaten candied apple. It was her. The image was grainy, insignificant to anyone else in the world. To Adrian, it was everything. It was proof. A pin on a map, a confirmation that his ghost was real. His legal team worked through the night, coordinating with counterparts in the neighboring country. The advice was unanimous, a soft approach. Marcus had built a life on running. A direct, aggressive confrontation could make him bolt, and this time, they might lose her forever. The next afternoon, Adrian stood a block away from the corner of 3rd and Main, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Ben was beside him, a silent, steadying presence. They waited until they saw Marcus amble up, his posture radiating impatience as he approached Alara to collect the day's meager earnings. Then, they moved. Adrian intercepted him, stepping into his path with a practiced ease that disarmed Marcus instantly. He was no longer a grieving father. He was the CEO, a man who commanded rooms with his presence alone. "Excuse me," Adrian said, his voice calm and pleasant. "My name is Adrian Sterling. I run a foundation for at-risk youth. I couldn't help but notice your daughter. She has a remarkable spirit." Marcus's eyes, initially suspicious, flickered to Adrian's tailored suit, his expensive watch, and then widened at the thick envelope Adrian held. Greed and arrogance washed over his features. "Yeah, she's a good kid," he said, puffing out his chest, launching into the familiar, well-rehearsed script of the struggling single father doing his best. Adrian listened, nodding sympathetically. He let Marcus finish, then slid the first knife in. "She looks so much like her mother." He paused. "What was her favorite lullaby?" "My wife, Anya. She used to sing one to our daughter about a little star." The name, Anya, hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face went slack, the color draining from it. I don't remember," he stammered. "Of course," Adrian said smoothly, his gaze like ice. "It's been a long time. She has a slight strawberry birthmark on her left shoulder blade, doesn't she? Just below the collarbone." Marcus took an involuntary step back, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. "You were at the Midvale Community Fair 2 years ago, weren't you?" Adrian pressed, his voice dropping, losing all pretense of pleasantry. "I imagine it's hard to keep track of all the places you've been." That was the final blow. The mention of a specific, obscure event in another country, a place he thought was buried in his past, shattered Marcus's fragile reality. The lies, so effective for so long, crumbled into dust. His face contorted in a mask of pure panic. "Who are you? What do you want?" he snarled, grabbing Alara's arm. It was the signal. 2 plain-clothed officers materialized from the flow of the crowd, their movements calm and economical. They flanked Marcus, their presence an undeniable wall of authority. A woman with a kind face and a gentle demeanor detached herself from a nearby doorway and walked directly toward Ilara. "Hello, Ilara," the woman said softly, ignoring Marcus's sputtering rage. "My name is Maria. I'm here to help." Marcus's bluster evaporated, replaced by the pathetic, cornered fear of a man whose long con had finally come to an end. He was led away, his protests dying in the city air. Adrian stood frozen, his role complete. He forced himself to stay back, to give the child, his child, space. He watched as Maria spoke to her in a low, reassuring voice, eventually coaxing her toward an unmarked car waiting at the curb. Just before she got in, Ilara turned. Her small, pale face was a canvas of bewilderment. Her eyes met Adrian's for a fleeting, unreadable second. Then she was gone, the car pulling silently into traffic. The ghost had a name. He had found her. But as he stood alone on the pavement, the gulf between them felt wider and more terrifying than ever before. Chapter 5. The Walls of Law and Memory. The interrogation room was small and airless, the color of weak tea. Under the flat, humming lights, Marcus's bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of bitter resentment. The detectives didn't need to press hard. The walls of his fabricated world, so sturdy in his own mind, were collapsing under their own weight. "I didn't take her," he insisted, his voice raspy. "Anya brought her to me. She was scared of him." He spat the word, as if Adrian's name was a poison. All his money, his enemies. She said he was suffocating her. She needed to breathe. I was the only one she trusted. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with the fire of his own delusion. This was his truth, polished over 8 years of lonely, resentful nights. He had been Anya's secret champion, the one who understood her artistic soul in a way the corporate titan never could. In his memory, her arrival on his doorstep, frantic and clutching her 2-year-old daughter, wasn't a psychotic break. It was a validation. It was the universe confirming what he'd always believed. He was the one who should have been with her. His own childhood, a chaotic shuffle between foster homes, had taught him that the only person you could rely on was yourself. He saw the same fragility in Anya, the same need for a protector. And then she was gone, he whispered, the memory still raw. The hit and run had been a cruel, random act of fate. He'd waited for her to come back to their dingy motel room, and when she didn't, panic had set in. He saw the system he'd spent his life evading, ready to swallow up this child, Anya's child. I couldn't let them take her. The system, it breaks kids, I know. I was doing what Anya would have wanted. I was keeping her safe. This conviction had fueled his flight across the border, the forged documents, the life lived in the shadows. But keeping her safe had morphed over the years. His own demons, his gambling addiction, resurfaced. Keeping her safe became keeping her fed. Keeping her fed became using her to pay his debts. In the twisted logic of his trauma, forcing her to beg wasn't exploitation. It was a gritty, real-world form of provision, far better than the cold charity of an orphanage. He had saved her, and she in turn owed him. The confession was a torrent of self-pity and warped justification. The sad, tangled story of a man who had tried to rescue someone else from drowning while he himself was sinking. Miles away, in a sterile conference room that smelled of expensive coffee and ambition, Adrian Sterling was learning a different, harsher truth. The walls here were not cinder block. They were glass, overlooking a city that bowed to his influence. But in this room, his power was an impediment. The court in Midvale sees a billionaire from another country attempting to claim a child who has been raised, however poorly, by one of their own citizens. His lead lawyer, a sharp woman named Elena, explained. Her tone was blunt, stripped of deference. "Your wealth, Mr. Sterling, doesn't look like a resource to them. It looks like a weapon. They are concerned about coercion, about the child's memories being manipulated." Adrian slammed his hand on the polished mahogany table. Manipulated? He manipulated her. He stole 8 years of her life. "I understand your frustration," Elena said, unmoved. "But the court's primary concern is the child's welfare, not rectifying the injustice done to you. She knows Marcus as her only guardian. Ripping her from that, however toxic, and placing her with a man who is to her a complete stranger, could cause irreparable psychological harm. So what is the solution?" Adrian demanded, the words tasting like ash. "The solution is patience," Elena replied. "The court has approved the DNA testing, of course, but pending the results and a full psychological evaluation, they are placing Alara, Lily, in a specialized reunification foster home. It's a neutral environment. The family is trained to handle trauma cases. It's the best course of action for her." The words hit Adrian with the force of a physical blow. A foster home. His daughter, his Lily, would be with strangers. After all this, after finding her, he was still separated from her by walls, not of lies anymore, but of law. Later that evening, a courier delivered a thick file to his penthouse. It was the complete police report on the Jane Doe who had been identified months after her death as Anya Sterling. Adrian sat alone, the city lights glittering below, and forced himself to read it. He saw the cold, bureaucratic language. Unidentified female, blunt force trauma. No personal effects. He saw the grainy, black and white photo of her belongings from the scene, a cheap coat, worn shoes. He read the coroner's clinical description of the woman he had loved. The report detailed how she had remained a nameless body in the county morgue for almost 3 months. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him. In his frantic, globe-spanning search for a living, breathing Anya, he had never once considered expanding the parameters to include the unidentified dead. His hope had been a form of blindness. While he was hiring investigators to chase down sightings in other countries, her body had been lying in a drawer less than 200 miles away. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He walked to his desk, pushed aside the quarterly reports and market analyses, and opened a new, blank document on his laptop. The anger, the grief, the profound sense of failure. It had to go somewhere. He began to type, not a business plan, but a mission statement. He would create a foundation, one with the resources to do what he had failed to do, to connect the dots, to fund the technology, to ensure that no other parent's search was ever again narrowed by their own hope. It was a penance, a purpose, born from the ashes of his own devastating oversight. He couldn't change the past, but he could, he realized, arm the future. Chapter 6. The Language of Silence. The Midvale Family Services Center was a building determined to be cheerful. The walls were painted a relentlessly optimistic shade of yellow, and the furniture was brightly colored plastic, designed to be both durable and disarming. To Adrian, the entire place felt like a lie. It smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. This was the neutral ground the court had decreed for his first supervised visit, a sterile arena for the most important negotiation of his life. He arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a cashmere sweater and dark trousers, an outfit carefully chosen to be less intimidating than his usual suit. It felt like a costume. In his hands, he held a gift, a slim, elegantly wrapped box containing the latest tablet, preloaded with educational games and creative apps. It was a logical, practical tool for connection. It was, he would soon learn, a mistake. The woman who met him was Dr. Aisha Sharma. She was a petite woman in her 50s, with intelligent, compassionate eyes that seemed to absorb everything. There was a calmness about her that was at odds with the forced cheerfulness of the building. Dr. Sharma, Adrian's lawyers had told him, had come to the country as a child refugee. She understood the profound dislocation of family separation, not as a theory, but as a lived experience. "She is waiting," Dr. Sharma said, her voice low and steady. "A few things to remember, Mr. Sterling. She is known here as Alara. That is her name for now. Do not ask her direct questions about her past. And please, just try to breathe." She led him to a small room with a child-sized table and 2 chairs. And there she was. Lily. She looked smaller than he remembered, swallowed by the unfamiliar, clean clothes provided by the foster home. Her dark hair was neatly brushed, but she sat hunched, her shoulders curved inward, as if to protect herself. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and he knew, with a father's instinct he didn't realize he possessed, that the smooth gray stone was hidden within her fist. She did not look up when he entered. The silence in the room was immense. Adrian, a man who could command a boardroom of 50 with a single sentence, was rendered mute. He sat down opposite her, the small plastic chair creaking under his weight. "Hello, Alara," he began, his voice sounding unnaturally loud. "I'm Adrian." There was no response. She was a statue carved from fear. He pushed the gift across the table. I brought you something. It has games on it. You can draw things." Her eyes flickered to the box for a second before returning to the floor. The gift was a foreign object, an intrusion. It represented a world she didn't know, a world of expectations she couldn't possibly meet. He pressed on, his anxiety making him clumsy. Do you like to draw? Your mother, Anya, she was a wonderful artist. At the mention of her mother, her small body tensed almost imperceptibly. It was the wrong thing to say. Another demand on a memory she couldn't access. He was asking for a connection that didn't exist, and the pressure was unbearable. She retreated further, building a wall of silence brick by silent brick. Her breathing was shallow, her stillness absolute. It was a defense mechanism perfected over years of uncertainty. If you don't move, if you don't speak, you cannot make a mistake. You cannot be a disappointment. The hour crawled by, a masterclass in failure. Adrian's attempts at conversation died in the suffocating silence. He was left with the sound of his own heartbeat and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation. When the time was up, Dr. Sharma entered and spoke to Lily in a gentle, murmuring tone. The girl rose and left without a single backward glance. Adrian was left alone at the small table with the untouched gift. Dr. Sharma returned a moment later and sat in the chair Lily had vacated. "That was difficult," she said. "It was not a question." "She wouldn't even look at me," Adrian said, the frustration evident in his voice. "I don't understand. I'm her father." "Biologically, yes," Dr. Sharma corrected gently. "But in her mind, you are a stranger who has taken her from the only life she knows." The man you see as her abuser, she sees as her only constant. That is the nature of trauma bonding. It is a survival strategy, not a rational choice. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Sterling, you came in here and tried to close a deal. You used logic, you offered an incentive, you invoked a shared history that, for her, is a blank page. You were speaking a language she no longer understands. You have to learn hers. And what language is that? Adrian asked, his voice raw. The language of silence, Dr. Sharma replied, of patience, of presence without expectation. For now, your only job is to share the same air with her and prove that you are not a threat. The gift, the questions, they are threats, they are demands. She has spent her life trying to meet the demands of a volatile man. Your demands feel no different to her. The words were a quiet indictment of his entire approach to life. He solved problems, he acquired assets, he managed outcomes. But this was not a problem to be solved. This was a person to be reached. He left the center and walked back to his car, the expensive tablet feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He, a man who commanded thousands, had been utterly defeated by the silence of a 10-year-old girl. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, and looked at the gift, a gleaming symbol of his own profound ignorance. For the first time, he understood. This was not a debt he could repay or a company he could acquire. This was a relationship he had to earn, one silent moment at a time. Chapter 7. Setbacks and Breakthroughs. The paradox of healing is that safety can feel like the most dangerous place on earth. In the quiet, predictable world of the foster home, with regular meals and a soft bed, the walls Lily had built around her trauma began to crumble. The nightmares came first. Fragmented images of shouting, of running, of the metallic screech of tires. She started waking up in the night, her heart pounding, the sheets damp with a child's cold sweat. Twice she wet the bed, a deep, primal shame that left her silent and withdrawn for hours. Her foster mother, a patient woman named Sarah, would report these incidents to Dr. Sharma, who would then relay them to Adrian. To him, it felt like a catastrophic failure. "She's getting worse?" he said during a phone call, his voice tight with a familiar corporate sense of a project going off the rails. "No, Mr. Sterling," Dr. Sharma corrected him gently. "She's beginning to feel safe enough to fall apart. The body keeps score. For years, hers has been in a state of high alert. Now, in a safe place, it's finally starting to release some of that terror. This is not regression. This is progress. It's just painful to watch." Adrian held on to those words during their next visit. He left the gifts and the questions behind. He simply brought a sketch pad and a set of charcoal pencils. He sat at the small table in the yellow room and, without a word to Lily, began to draw. He wasn't an artist like Anya, but he could sketch the buildings he saw from his office window, rendering their sharp, clean lines on the page. He drew for 20 minutes, aware of her presence, of her shallow breathing, but not looking at her. He just existed in the space with her, creating something quiet instead of demanding it. Then he felt a subtle shift in the room. He risked a glance. Lily had moved her chair closer, her dark eyes fixed on the movement of his hand across the paper. On the table between them, her own hand was uncurled. In her palm lay the smooth, gray stone. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He recognized it instantly. It was from a photograph he had stared at 1,000 times. A picture of Anya, pregnant with Lily, sitting in the Ryoan-ji Zen garden in Kyoto. She had been holding a nearly identical stone, one she'd picked up from the raked gravel, marveling at its perfect, simple form. His first instinct was to exclaim, to point, to claim the connection. "I know that stone. Your mother loved that place." But Dr. Sharma's voice echoed in his mind. Presence without expectation. He put down his charcoal pencil. He did not look at the stone, but past it, as if to a memory. "My wife, Anya," he said, his voice soft, directed at the drawing rather than at Lily. "She loved quiet places. There was this garden we visited once, before you were born. It was just sand and rocks. She said it was a place where you could hear the world breathe." He paused, picking up the pencil again. "She found a stone there, just like that one. She said it was a perfect little piece of silence she could hold in her hand. He didn't ask where she got it. He didn't try to link her to the memory. He just offered it, a story laid gently on the table between them, with no expectation of it being picked up." He glanced at her. Lily was staring at the stone in her palm, her expression one of intense, dawning wonder. A flicker of something, not a full memory, but the ghost of one, was moving behind her eyes. For the first time, a piece of her hidden, fragmented past had found a corresponding piece in the real world. It was a tiny click of a lock, the first tumblers falling into place. It was a breakthrough. The setback came a week later. The high of the breakthrough had made Adrian careless with his optimism. He arrived at the center feeling buoyant, hopeful. But the moment he saw Lily, he knew something was wrong. She was rigid, her face a pale, tight mask of fury. Dr. Sharma met him in the hallway. "There was an incident," she said quietly. "One of the older children in the foster home saw a news report about Marcus's arrest. He called Marcus a monster. Alara reacted very strongly. The session was a return to the absolute, unbreachable silence of their first meeting. But this time, it was not born of fear. It was a cold, defiant anger. She would not look at him. She would not acknowledge him. He was the man who had caused this, the man who had taken her protector away and allowed others to call him names. He sat there for the full hour, the silence a punishment. When he left, the weight of the setback was heavier than any of his initial failures. He had thought they were building a bridge, but he now saw that the chasm was deeper than he had ever imagined. And at the bottom of it was her fierce, tangled loyalty to the man who had hurt her. He realized then that healing wasn't about replacing bad memories with good ones. It was about making space for all of them. Her fear of Marcus, her anger at him, and her protective, trauma-forged love for him. They all existed at once. To deny any part of it was to deny her. The path forward wasn't a straight line. It was a messy, painful spiral, and he was just beginning to learn its shape. Chapter 8. A father's education. The drive back from the disastrous last visit was thick with a silence heavier than any Adrian had shared with his daughter. Ben navigated the city traffic with his usual calm, but his eyes kept flicking to Adrian's rigid profile in the rearview mirror. Finally, as they pulled into the sterile quiet of the penthouse's underground garage, Ben switched off the engine and turned in his seat. "My granddaughter, Sarah," Ben said, his voice soft but clear in the enclosed space. "After we lost her, my wife and I, we tried to keep her room exactly as it was. For months, we thought we were preserving her memory. But what we were really doing was preserving our own pain. We were making a museum out of it." Adrian remained silent, staring ahead at the concrete wall. "One day," Ben continued, My wife went in and packed up a single box of Sarah's clothes to donate. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. But she said that letting go of the sweater didn't mean she was letting go of the memory of Sarah wearing it. It just made space to breathe. You're trying to give Lily back her entire past in one go, sir. Maybe she just needs space to breathe. Ben's wisdom was different from Dr. Sharma's clinical advice. It was practical, earned through loss. He wasn't a psychologist analyzing trauma. He was a grandfather who understood grief. His words cut through Adrian's complex layers of guilt and frustration, hitting a simple, human truth. Adrian had been treating Lily's past as a stolen asset to be recovered and returned, a ledger to be balanced. He hadn't thought of it as a room she might not be ready to re-enter. "What do I do, Ben?" Adrian asked, the question raw and stripped of all his usual authority. "You stop trying to furnish the room," Ben said simply. "You just sit on the floor with her until she's ready to pick out the paint." That advice became Adrian's mantra. His education as a father began not with a breakthrough, but with a surrender. He surrendered his timelines, his expectations, his need to fix things. For their next visit, he brought nothing but the sketch pad and a small box of colored pencils. He walked into the yellow room, gave Lily a small, quiet nod, and sat at the table. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her expectantly. He simply opened the pad and began to draw. He sketched the view from his office window again, the familiar cityscape of sharp lines and towering glass. He drew what he knew. Lily watched him from her chair, her body tense with suspicion. She was waiting for the trick, the question, the demand that was sure to follow. But it never came. There was only the soft, rhythmic scratch of pencil on paper. It was a sound without threat. After 10 minutes of this quiet, steady rhythm, she slid off her chair and walked over to the table, stopping a few feet away. She watched his hand move, her head tilted. He didn't acknowledge her directly, but he pushed the open box of colored pencils toward the center of the table. It was an offering, not a demand. Another 5 minutes passed. Then, with a tentative, bird-like quickness, she reached out and took a blue pencil. She didn't return to her chair. She stood beside him, leaned over the table, and on the corner of his drawing, she began to add to the sky. She drew a small, simple bird. It was just a V shape, a child's shorthand for flight. But to Adrian, it was the most beautiful and complex thing he had ever seen. He paused his own drawing. He watched as she picked up a yellow pencil and drew a sun, its rays jagged and fierce. They worked in silence, a shared, unspoken language of color and line. He drew the city, and she filled its sky. For the first time, they were not a stranger and a victim, or a father and a long-lost daughter. They were just two people at a table, making something together. It was a fragile truce, a bridge built of paper and wax. They were still drawing when Dr. Sharma opened the door, her face breaking into a slow, genuine smile at the scene before her. The call came 2 days later. Adrian was in a meeting, staring blankly at a presentation on market projections, when his personal phone vibrated. It was his lawyer, Elena. "The DNA results are in, Adrian," she said, her professional tone softened by a hint of warmth. "It's a conclusive 99.99% match. The court has received the report. We can file for the final custody transfer." Adrian closed his eyes. He felt a wave of profound relief. But it wasn't the triumphant, fist-pumping victory he might have once imagined. The legal confirmation felt strangely hollow, like an echo of a battle that had already been won and lost on a much more important front. The paper from the lab proved he was her father. The small blue bird she had drawn on his sketch proved something else entirely, that one day she might let him be. The legal victory was an end, but the drawing was a beginning. Chapter 9. The first step, the day Adrian was granted full custody of his daughter, did not arrive with a clap of thunder, but with the quiet rustle of paper. He stood in the familiar, cheerful hallway of the foster home, holding a court-stamped document that felt both impossibly heavy and ridiculously flimsy. It was the legal key to his daughter's life, but he knew it unlocked nothing of substance. The real doors were all still closed. Sarah, the foster mother, had packed Lily's few belongings into a small, new-looking backpack. There wasn't much: a few sets of clothes, the sketch pad filled with their shared drawings, and a worn copy of a children's book Sarah had been reading to her. When Lily appeared in the doorway, she was clutching the backpack straps, her knuckles white. She looked from Sarah's kind, sad face to Adrian's quiet, waiting one. There were no tears. Her goodbyes had been said in the quiet moments of the morning. This was just the final formal act of departure. The scene was quiet, almost unnervingly so. It was not a joyful reunion. It was a transfer, a handing over. Lily was leaving the first structured, truly safe environment she had ever known for a future that was a complete unknown. She walked toward Adrian, her steps small and deliberate, and for the first time, she slipped her hand into his. Her fingers were tiny and cold. It was not a gesture of affection, but of necessity, anchoring herself to the only solid object in a world that was tilting on its axis. The drive to the penthouse was a study in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the hostile, fearful silence of their first meetings, nor the companionable, creative silence of their drawing sessions. It was the vast, empty silence of uncertainty. Lily sat beside him, staring out the window as the familiar, gritty landscape of Midvale gave way to the gleaming, vertical world of the city. When the car descended into the private garage beneath the penthouse, the change was absolute. The air grew cool and still. The echo of the closing garage door was the only sound. They rode the private elevator up 34 floors in silence. As the doors opened, directly into the apartment's foyer, Lily physically recoiled. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, a space designed to impress, to dominate. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating vast, empty spaces, minimalist furniture, and polished marble floors that reflected the sky. To a child who had known only cramped rooms and crowded streets, it was terrifying. It was the opposite of cozy, the opposite of safe. It was a symbol of everything she was not. Adrian saw the fear in her eyes, the way she seemed to shrink in the enormous space. "This is your room," he said gently, leading her down a long hallway to a door he hadn't opened in years. The room was clean and new, furnished with things a 2-year-old would have loved. It was a perfect, preserved time capsule of his grief. Lily walked into the center of the room and stopped. She looked at the small bed, the empty shelves, the closet full of clothes for a child that no longer existed. She dropped her backpack on the floor, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. Then she walked to the far corner, sat down, and curled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. She was overwhelmed. Later that evening, as Adrian stood in his kitchen, unsure how to even begin the simple act of making a child dinner. His phone buzzed. It was an email from his lawyer, Elena. Subject, Marcus Thorne. Adrian, just to update you. Marcus took the plea deal. Child endangerment. Fraud. He won't be eligible for parole for at least 5 years. The interesting part happened at the sentencing. He stood up and spoke. He apologized. Not to the court, but to her. He said he was sorry he hadn't been the man her mother needed, and that he'd let his own grief and failure make him into a monster. It was a quiet, somber affair. I thought you should know. Adrian read the email twice. There was no sense of victory, no triumphant satisfaction. There was only a profound, weary sadness. The villain of his story had, in the end, revealed himself to be just another broken man. His conviction was not a resolution that tied things up neatly, but another loose, frayed end in a story full of them. He looked down the long, silent hallway toward his daughter's room. The first step had been taken, but the road home, he now understood, was impossibly long. Chapter 10. A new beginning. There would be no fairy tale ending. Adrian knew that now. There would be no cinematic, tearful embrace where the wounds of the past magically healed. The credits did not roll here. This was not an ending at all, but the first, terrifying day of a new and uncertain beginning. He found her still in her room, hours later, in the exact same spot. She had not moved from the corner, a small, still point of defiance in the vast, empty space. The sun had set, and the city beyond the enormous window had transformed into a glittering tapestry of light, but it offered no warmth. He had ordered food, but it sat untouched on the kitchen island. The silence of the penthouse, once his refuge, now felt like a crushing weight. He stood in the doorway, the lessons from Dr. Sharma and the memory of Ben's quiet wisdom echoing in his mind. Don't crowd her. Presence without expectation. Sit on the floor until she's ready to pick out the paint. He walked over to the bookshelf, a relic from his own childhood that his parents had insisted on keeping. He scanned the titles, his fingers tracing the worn spines. He wasn't looking for a story with a grand moral, but for something simple, something quiet. He chose an old, familiar copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, its pages softened with age. He didn't walk toward Lily. Instead, he slid down the wall opposite her, mirroring her posture, and sat on the polished floor. The distance between them felt immense, a chasm of unspoken pain and misunderstanding. He didn't try to bridge it. He simply acknowledged it by respecting its boundaries. He opened the book. His voice, when he began to read, was low and steady, directed not at her, but into the quiet space between them. There was once a velveteen rabbit, and in the beginning he was really splendid. He read without inflection, without trying to perform. He wasn't reading to her, a demand for her attention. He was reading for her, creating an anchor of sound in the overwhelming silence, a steady rhythm to prove that he could exist in the same room without needing anything from her. He was offering a piece of quiet he could hold in his hand. He read about the skin horse and what it means to be real. He read about love and loss and becoming. He did not look up. He did not check to see if she was listening. He just read. After several pages, he sensed a change. It was minute, almost imperceptible. The frantic, nervous fidgeting she did with the gray stone in her hand had stopped. The small, repetitive motion had ceased. He kept reading, his voice a calm, even thread in the darkness. Lily did not look at him. She did not speak. She did not move from her corner. But in the vast, intimidating silence of her new life, She listened. And for tonight, that was enough. It was not a hug. It was not a solution. It was a promise. It was the first night of 1,000 nights of healing that lay ahead, each one a step on a long and uncertain road. The quiet persistence of hope, so long a silent tenant in a little girl's heart, had finally found a voice to answer it.